Alright, so to continue my trend of discussing topics long after their initial moment in the sun, which is par for the course for me now, today I want to dive into the topic of censorship and more specifically the stance that Sony has taken with regards to sexual content. Before anyone hammers out a paragraph in the comments about how I'm just mad that anime titties are under attack, no, well, I mean partially yes, but mostly no. The angle I want to explore is how this new censorship policy, or lack thereof in terms of guideline clarity, has a decidedly negative impact on development and is also indicative of a larger, possibly more sinister phenomenon. This isn't breaking news by any stretch. Most of the headlines related to the topic broke in April a couple of months ago, but since then there have been a few further developments, and also the discussion has died down significantly, while the ill-defined subjective policy remains active. It all truly kicked off, as far as I can tell, with a Wall Street Journal article. In the lead up to that article, there had been what seemed to be arbitrary censorship executed by Sony and aimed at sexually suggestive content released on their platform. But when the journal published a segment with several quotes from Sony officials, the events took on a whole new light. A Sony spokeswoman confirmed the company has established its own guidelines so that creators can offer well-balanced content on the platform, and gaming does not inhibit the sound growth and development of young people. She declined to say when these guidelines were introduced or to discuss them in detail. Now, clearly articulated and well-constructed content guidelines are often useful and widely present in modern-day society. YouTube has content guidelines, for instance, and while their clarity certainly leaves a lot to be desired at times, it is entirely understandable that they have an established set of user terms and conditions. Likewise, a streaming platform such as Twitch also has a set of content guidelines, but in this case we can see uneven enforcement of those guidelines, which has been the root cause of a larger than desirable amount of unrest. Uneven enforcement of policies or rule sets is extremely problematic. For platforms like Twitch and YouTube, it can result in uncertain working conditions for creators because they are not precisely clear on what a particular outcome might be. But for a company such as Sony, with a platform that revolves around complex video game material, often developed by large teams of salary-dependent workers, having guidelines that lack clarity is an extremely damaging thing. There are a number of different games that can serve as examples when it comes to the impact that Sony's policies have had, but I'm going to focus less on what specific games have been affected and more on why the situation is so problematic, even if the current instances at the moment are not all that interesting or relevant to a lot of different gamers. For more context, here is another paragraph from the Wall Street Journal article referencing the statements from Sony officials. Two factors last year combined to turn that unease into action, these Sony officials say. One was the rise of the Me Too movement in the US, which pointed to the dangers of being associated with content that some might see as demeaning to women. The second was the emergence of channels on sites like YouTube and Amazon's Twitch, where gamers play in front of a camera and are watched by fans online. That means games meeting Japan's laxer standards can get worldwide exposure. This right here gives us a baseline as to the reason behind Sony's new stance. The important line is in reference to the rise of the Me Too movement in the United States and how it has led to dangers of being associated with content that some might see as demeaning to women. On a surface level, this might make sense, but in reality, the Me Too movement does not pertain to sexually suggestive content or entertainment material that might be perceived as demeaning to women. It relates to workplace harassment. Now, here's where things get a little more confusing. A few days later, another Sony spokesperson contradicted the previous statements made by the Wall Street Journal and their contacts with the following statement. Sony, though rare, has a policy of having executive officers comb through content that may be considered offensive and unsafe on a case-by-case basis. This is so players can enjoy games while at the same time respecting the ideas of creators. And then, immediately after, not all games will be scrutinized to this degree. This is due to the existing CERO standards and no standardized guidelines. But if the game is excessively sexual, then they will look toward their global standard that will have an executive review the content in question, which is generally reserved for strict sexual content. There it is. Extrapolating the information from these statements made by Sony representatives, we can see that the company has a case-by-case method of evaluating sexual material, based on a current social trend within the US that broadly speaking does not even relate to the material they are now choosing to censor. Furthermore, the final decision appears to hinge on a single executive, which makes the entire process extremely subjective. Sony also acknowledged a lack of standardized guidelines, which further compounds the subjectivity involved when a single person, with no surrounding framework for that decision, is faced with the choice of censoring a game's content, thus forcing it back into an iterative development process which takes time and money, or inversely allowing it to release with the fear of incurring outrage over contemporary social trends. Because of this murky situation, developers are faced with a series of choices, knowing full well that there is no standard format by which to judge their game's eligibility. If the project they are working on comes anywhere near the possible line in the sand, for lack of a better way to describe it, a line that is different on a day-by-day basis, by the way, if their game is even remotely approaching that line, they can either risk a subjective decision which may send them back to the development phase, wasting time and money, or immediately compromise their existing vision to avoid that possibility. Sony has decided to ignore the broader scope of industry rating boards, which have existed for quite a long time, and instead opted for platform censorship with uneven enforcement. A primary justification revolves around the age-old trope of, we have to protect the children. But any child old enough to be playing these games, with access to the World Wide Web, is a child that has the capability to see pretty much anything at any time, anywhere, for any reason, with almost no way to stop them. Competing companies like Microsoft and Nintendo have a wildly different approach, with Nintendo making a statement that they do not regulate sexual content, they simply force games to obtain a rating from national bodies and empower parents to control the content which their children consume, a process that seems far more reasonable. The reason this is indicative of a larger issue is because of the intentionally vague framework. Since Sony has established a position of regulation based on contemporary social trends, with a system for executive oversight that comes down to individual preference, this opens the door for anything deemed controversial at all to be censored. As many gamers are well aware, there is a decisive effort among certain publications and groups to demonize violent video games and link them to real-world violent behavior through the misrepresentation of data. If these activists, or whatever it is they are classified as nowadays, should be successful and video game violence falls under the microscope as a phenomenon that, as Sony would phrase it, inhibits the sound growth and development of young people, with the current censorship system in place, executives at the company could begin to deny games with violence owing to their fear of outrage or backlash, sending them back to the drawing board and massively impacting an enormous section of gaming. There's a pretty alarming trend, not just in modern gaming, but many facets of modern society, where instead of recognizing the necessity of free speech, many individuals and groups now clamor for anything that diverges from their preferences to be banned or made outright illegal. It may seem a bit comical when the current target is something that many find to be trivial. A lot of viewers may think, who cares, this means nothing, it's just the jiggle physics on anime titties, what does it matter? And they would be right in the assessment that in this one particular instance, it is relatively unimportant, though to be fair, there is a dedicated community surrounding many of these games that have been abruptly censored by Sony and forced to rework their core features. But the problem is not what is being censored right now, rather how the framework by which the content arrives at a censorship decision is constructed. Here's another example. Recently, I experienced a massive influx of comments that had been flagged for review. I do not know the full extent of what happened, but YouTube had determined all of the comments that contained the word cuck were offensive and removed them from my videos for moderation. It was hundreds upon hundreds of comments from weeks, even months ago. The word cuck is a derivative of the word cuckold, and loosely speaking, it means a weak man. It is fairly often used as an insult by right-leaning individuals on the political spectrum and aimed at left-leaning individuals. Now, YouTube has every right to do this. It's totally their decision. It's not even a full ban, it's merely a retroactive classification that marked the comments as spam. But if the word cuck is being flagged, then why not the word incel? For those that don't know, incel is a derivative of involuntary celibate and loosely means a loser who can't get laid. It is often used by left-leaning individuals on the political spectrum and aimed at right-leaning individuals. But incel is not flagged or moderated at all, for some reason. Cuck has been deemed too offensive and thus subjected to auto-moderation at a site-wide level, and I'm not advocating the same treatment for the word incel at all. Quite the opposite, in fact, since YouTube has arbitrarily determined one word to be worthy of site-wide retroactive spam moderation, purely based on contemporary, oh my feelings are hurt whining. What's next after that? The ESRB is the internal ratings board for the United States. There are other rating organizations as well, like PEGI, for instance. And rather than default to these preset parameters for an age restriction, specifically when it comes to sexual content, Sony has decided to internally use the most arbitrary methods possible based off of potential social outrage or backlash, which, as we all know, is an ever-changing puddle of quicksand that cannot be predicted or adhered to with any useful degree of consistency. Sony and their censorship policy is a legitimate problem for gaming, not because of what they are censoring right now, but because of what they might censor tomorrow and why. When the goalpost is always moving, a lot of players will think in the moment and tell themselves, it's okay that the goalpost just moved because I can still make that shot. It just hasn't affected me personally yet. But when the goalpost keeps on moving consistently, eventually less and less people can make the shot, and they start to regret not taking a firmer stance before that point. To speak is to risk being offensive. For Sony to disallow game features and reject developer applications because of what might be offensive, based on an ever-changing set of criteria and determined by nothing more than a subjective individual, is a very, very slippery slope. And at the very least, it warranted a bit of a discussion video outlining the problems with their current approach. That's it though. If you want to support the channel, check out the links down below. We have merch, memberships, and some other stuff as well, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.